we started to discuss the use of technology in education a number of years, but there has been an increasing focus in the Africa region, how we can really take advantage of digital technologies in education, then to enhance learning, productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, so that the systems can become more efficient and effective in the delivery of education, in basic and secondary education, but also in the Tibet and the higher education. Today, we will have this training today, as I said. Alex and the team will start. The one thing really I have been last few years, as I have been reviewing different projects, project appraisal documents, or look at some of the implementation, the question becomes how effective, how we are able to operationalize the use of technologies in education. To me, that is at the end what it matters. We have been using this, the concept, the use of technologies for many, many years. But now the question becomes how we can really take advantage of it, especially in light of COVID-19. I think that really highlighted in many of our countries remote learning. 2 years ago, we were discussing more how to take advantage to enhance learning, but now also to deliver learning actually to use by using digital technologies. So without much introduction, actually, you know Alex, he's part of our GIG team. Alex, I'll ask you to introduce you and your team, and then give us the context actually today and tomorrow, what you would like to do, and also how our colleagues can reach out to you to seek your guidance, advice, as we try to operationalize and scale up some of our activities, implementation activities in this area. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Halil, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Alex Twinomgisha. I'm part of the Global EdTech team, and I would really like to extend a great thanks to Halil and your fellow PMs for giving us this opportunity as the EdTech team to make to conduct this training and hopefully share some insights. But we would also like to hear from you, from the TTLs, on what the issues are, the questions on the ground. Today, we'll be focusing on digital foundations, kind of the key foundations to use EdTech, so the devices, the content, the learning management systems, and the education management information systems. So we have an interesting format that we are going to follow. And then tomorrow, we'll kind of look more at around the capabilities and applications. And we will look at assessment, which has been a very hot topic during COVID. How do we assess remotely? An increasing hot topic in education. We'll look at literacy apps, which feeds into our learning poverty agenda. We'll look at the skills teachers need to have, especially to support things like remote learning. And then we'll end with a fascinating discussion around recovering from learning losses using tutoring and remedial. Bob will give some kind of more insights now. And then Mike will be the overall moderator for these 2 days. I think everybody knows Bob and Mike. We have a number of consultants today that will be making the presentation, and you'll get a chance to meet them all. Please use the chat to post any questions, and we'll also post an email in which you can contact us. With that, thank you again, Halil, and over to Bob, and we can kick off the formal agenda.
Thanks, Halil, Mike, and Alex. Great to be here with everybody this morning. Just very quickly, I think I just want to reiterate one thing that Alex said, that with the EdTech team, we've been trying to listen to kind of what your demands are, what you're hearing from clients, what are your main binding constraints, and how we can help you think through how to most effectively design and implement EdTech components to improve teaching and learning, particularly during this time of COVID when schools were closed. But I think increasingly as countries are looking towards building a more resilient system for hybrid learning. We launched our strategy paper or approach paper this past year, which has 5 principles. The first one is Ask Why. And we've used this as a framework for dialoguing with you on how to think about the integration of EdTech. And you'll hear this, I think, throughout these next few days, is always asking why. What is the purpose of this investment? What do you want to see in terms of the changes in the classroom? The second is For All at Scale. And I think you'll hear a lot about digital infrastructure. Federico will talk today about devices. So looking about kind of this access issue, which is a huge issue across all of our countries, and different ways in which to bridge these new digital divides around access. The third is empowering teachers. So at the heart of education is the teacher. And as Alex said, we'll talk about that more tomorrow in terms of the changing role of the teachers, the new skills that are being asked of teachers, and how at the end of the day, technology can better empower them. And then the fourth area is engaging the ecosystem, recognizing that ministries of education cannot do this alone. And I think part of this also is the time needed for ministries of education to be able to really assess and integrate technology. And this gets to the fifth principle, which is be data-driven, which is kind of the changing role of ministries of education to be able to use data in a more real-time environment, to be able to make decisions more effectively, and to be able to build system resilience. So again, I just wanted to emphasize these 5 principles that will be woven into the discussion over these next 2 days. And again, we really want to hear back from you. Do these knowledge packs resonate with the challenges you're facing? We started to develop these over a year ago in response to demand from a number of different countries, not just in the Africa region, but across the portfolio. So this is an opportunity for you to give us feedback also as to, are these the questions that you really need to have answered? So again, thanks so much and looking forward to the discussion. Over.
Mike will take it on from here on. Introduce the presenters and then also moderate the Q&A. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks so much, Halil, Alex, and Bob. We have a jam-packed session this afternoon, this morning. We will kick it off with 10 minutes of presentation and 10 minutes of discussion from Federico Cavallo. He'll be talking about devices in education. And I'll remind all presenters to please keep to your time. I will be cutting in if you go over time because we have 4 great discussions today and we want to make sure we get to all of them. With that said, I turn it over to you, Federico. He's starting to share his content now. Everyone, please do post questions, comments, concerns, information in the chat. We'll be monitoring it throughout. Over to you, Federico.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. I will be focusing, as Mike said, on devices. And this will be really a sneak peek into the knowledge pack that was created. And the intent is just to give you a high-level flavor of what's inside. The main thing that we're trying to answer with this knowledge pack is how can we make better decisions when we try to deploy a device in education. So that's what I'm going to cover today within the next 10 minutes, and then try to answer any questions that come up. So the first thing is, how do we determine the right device for education? And we're proposing a 4-step approach. The first one being, following what Bob was saying about asking why. What is it that we're trying to achieve with deploying a device? What is the learning experience that we're trying to support with that device? And we call those use case scenarios. And I'll show you some examples of those in the next couple of minutes. Once we've determined the different use case scenarios that we're trying to support, the next thing is to be realistic and really understand what is the current situation, what environment are we trying to deploy these devices on. And so I'll also show you some of the different scenarios and what implications that has on the choices that we make of the devices. The third is obviously then what are the solutions that we're going to deploy. And the solutions is not just a device, but everything that goes around the device. And a very important aspect in choosing the solutions is to pay attention to what we call the total cost of ownership, which is looking beyond just the initial cost of the device, but really of everything that needs to be in place during the lifetime of the device to make sure that the user, teacher, student, has the ability to use that device throughout this lifetime. And finally, the recommendation is to learn and not to be afraid to look into really what's happened and make different decisions if that's the case moving forward. So here the invitation is really to evaluate the experience and try to improve from each deployment to another to really improve with the experience that you get. So moving forward to the use case scenarios. So these are just some examples of some of the scenarios that we might want to support from a learning perspective that are aligned with the issues or strategies that we have to solve those issues that are defined to support some of the existing challenges. So for instance, if you're looking at a scenario in which the challenge is to support children out of school, so obviously you're looking into distance education, your use case scenarios is the ability for teachers to create, deliver, and manage remote lessons. Another use case scenario could be from the student perspective to be able to engage in remote learning and throughout the whole process to support formative assessment, right? Maybe in a asynchronous manner. So how does the device support that? And we need to look at what are the features and the conditions in which this device will be used so that we can achieve this learning experience. So that takes us into the next level, and the next level is really to look at what the existing conditions that we're going to operate on. There's two critical dimensions for technology to work. They're quite obvious, but sometimes not really considered adequately when we're designing the project. And the first one is obviously electricity and its availability and reliability. And the second dimension is the connectivity. So if we have or not electricity available where we're deploying technology, if that electricity is more or less reliable, or if it's just working properly, and the same for internet. And this will affect significantly the key features of the devices that we will consider. For instance, if we're operating in an environment where there's no electricity and we'll have to support solar charging, and there might be limited internet, maybe just mobile internet service, obviously we're looking probably at mobile devices. We can't consider a PC lab with desktops. We'll be looking at things that have a low power consumption, probably large battery capacities, and large storage, because we will be operating probably without being able to charge very frequently, and we'll probably have to store a lot of the content on the device itself. And this is just one example to illustrate how the existing conditions will predefine what's possible. The next level is then to look at, so what's the right device? Now we know what we're trying to achieve, and here are just, again, some of the education objectives that you might have set up and some of the use case scenarios related to those education objectives. And this is just an empiric evaluation of the suitability of a certain device to support a use case. And so you'll see that there's devices that are broader in the support of different use case scenarios, and others that are more adequate to certain use case scenarios than others. There's also another dimension which is really important when we're defining the right device, which is the age group that we're dealing with. So if the device is for very young kids, grade 1 and 2, where they're learning to read and write, there are certain features that we will be looking on the device that are very different if we're addressing those devices to students that are, in higher education or in college. And so depending on the use case scenarios and what we're going to do with the device, it's really important to consider the form factor and the features of the device. And moving forward within devices, I think one aspect that is really frequently overlooked throughout many of the projects is that a device that we deploy, the cost of that device is not just the acquisition cost. There's a number of other costs involved that actually make the total cost of deploying that device much higher than the acquisition cost. And sometimes governments and your clients in this case get fixated on the initial acquisition cost, and they totally disregard things like the deployment costs, the cost of operation, and also the disposal and replacement costs. So an example that I came across recently, in a certain country in Africa, Android tablets were deployed. Their cost was X, and at the end of the year, this was in an unconnected environment. At the end of the year, these tablets will be retrieved and will be just reformatted, and everything will be installed and redeployed again. And the reality in this specific case was that they were able to only retrieve half of the tablets, and the majority of those retrieved had issues, needed repairs, physical repairs. And they estimated the lifetime of those tablets to be around 2 to 3 years. So they decided to replace those tablets in 2017 with ruggedized laptops running Windows. The cost of those laptops was double of the Android tablets. But the reality is that their experience retrieving them was much higher because they were branded and ruggedized, and it was really hard to hide the fact that it was specific to that project. And the majority of them at the end of the year did not need repairs and lasted much longer than the tablet. So at the end of the day, they realized that the total cost of ownership of the ruggedized laptops was actually lower than the tablets. So an invitation here is really to, when designing a project, to consider all the costs involved in running these devices throughout their lifetime. And so some guidance is around the fact that some of the initial costs usually are somewhere between 30 to 40% of the total costs. Really depends if you consider training in this or not, or if you're just considering the costs directly related to keeping those devices running. But it's important to keep these numbers in mind. And there's a lot of experience, so we can share some experiences from different countries around how these different costs impact the total cost of ownership. So moving forward to the last I'm missing a slide here. I'm not sure why. So anyhow, one of the most important things in any project is to make sure that we're learning from what's happening, and we incorporate that learning into the different phases of redesigning the project. So any deployment should follow usually 3 major phases. We've seen that a lot of the projects move very swiftly from a manifesto announcement by a president to the deployment, what we would call the deployment phase, totally overriding the first phase, which would be the design of the project. So design is really when we clearly identify what we're trying to achieve. We put a team in place. We identify what are the use cases and what are the right devices. We budget for the whole project, not just for the acquisition. We prepare the whole environment to accommodate those devices. We focus on risk mitigation, on looking for interdependencies, for instance, with electricity and connectivity, and we communicate, which is one of the key things. And then we can move on to the next phases of the project, which are about deploying, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And finally, once it's deployed, another overlooked aspect is the sustainability aspects. So I'm going to stop here. I'm on top of my time, I believe, Mike. And if there's any comments or questions, I can take them up.
Thank you so much, Federico. Everyone, that was a preview of a much larger knowledge pack and a preview of an upcoming in-depth session as part of the World Bank Policy Academy on devices in education. We'd be happy to take questions for Federico now. I already see one in the chat, Federico, about handheld devices. What is the current thinking around handheld devices in education? I guess we could be talking about phones in particular, but what do you see happening with phones and other handheld devices? Where are they being used? By whom? Are they appropriate or not?
Yeah, I think once again that depends on what we're trying to achieve and what's possible. And those are always the two dimensions. What we're trying to achieve goes back to the use case scenario. So what is it that we're trying, what learning experience are we trying to support? And what is possible? What can we afford and what conditions we have to deploy? So if I've seen a lot of examples around, using mobile phones just to send reminders or to send snippets of information, to keep the communication with the parents. Those could be perfectly suitable for those use case scenarios. Now, if we're trying to support project-based learning and collaboration, maybe a handheld device will not be the most suitable device to support those use case scenarios. And so I think it really depends on what we're trying to achieve and then what conditions we have. If we're trying to leverage what exists already, so we'll be limiting what's possible to the capabilities of the device. What I see very frequently is that we limit our thinking to what exists and not to what's possible. And so the invitation would be always to let's see what we're really trying to achieve, and then let's bring it down to reality and see within that what's possible and how. And so handheld devices could play a role there, but that really depends on what we're trying to achieve. We need to design the learning experience and then see if that device will support it and up to where it will support.
Excellent, thank you. What are some good practice examples of, you have this three-stage process of design, deploy, and sustain. Are there places we should look, Federico, for good examples in real life? Or maybe where we should look for bad examples that we make sure we don't want to repeat?
Yeah, I think there's a few good examples of people that have been doing this for a while. The one that always comes to mind that might not be applicable to many parts of Africa is Plan Ceibal in Uruguay. They were one of the first countries to broadly deploy technology, and they've been learning a lot with the experience. And so with time, they've put in place a dedicated institution focusing on supporting that project. And they've been running it like, I would say, almost an enterprise. So it's very professionalized, the way that they run these deployments for the past 13 years. And so I think there's a lot to learn there. The fact that they have very good connectivity might be the aspect that is a bit different from many parts of Africa that I know are much more limited in their connectivity. But the principles behind how it's been managed, I think they're a very good example. I remember Portugal, where I'm based, back in 2007, when they decided to deploy devices to all students. They also deployed, the way they've done it is a very good example to look at. One of the biggest learnings of all these projects is when governments decide to create an independent entity to run these projects and not just have it under some ministry involved in a lot of political aspects. And I think one of the big learnings is to allow an independent entity to manage these projects. And there's quite a few examples on how that works. The other thing is whenever there's partnerships with the private sector, I think that's a big learning. Gauteng is doing that, for instance, for the Gauteng, the province in South Africa. They've outsourced the whole operation of the devices, and so they rely on a private sector partner to make sure that everything's working. And there's a number of other examples. I could be talking for a lot longer, so I'll stop here for now.
Mike, could I ask a question?
Please, Halil.
Thanks so much for very good presentation. Many of our projects, I cover Western and Central African countries, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and so on. Your presentation is very clear. The connectivity and power are essential, but there are solutions, I guess, as I hear. And the countries have been using different devices for the purpose of management, the management information systems, the data collection, including tablets. The challenges we have been hearing from our management. There's some background noise actually. I don't know, Mike. The challenge is that how do we use the different devices to improve teaching learning? Why we cannot transform and then provide, and I'm just simplifying the solution. Why don't we just provide everyone tablet and we load them all the content? I'm just simplifying the question. So how do we use technology in low capacity environments to improve learning? I'm going to give you an example in Sierra Leone or in one of the states in Nigeria. Low capacity, and then you have the solution, but you don't have the really effective teachers, low accountability. And then, okay, can we find something, especially during this COVID times, by providing the loaded, the content, the tablets, everyone, you solve the problem. I'm just simplifying, but this is this type of question we often receive from different colleagues. What would be your response? Then you have funding, and then help us to design a program, and then we solve the problem.
Yeah, thank you, Halil. I think that's an awesome question. I think there's this idea or dream that if we deploy technology, everything will be sorted out and problems will just disappear. And the reality is the opposite. Technology is just one small element of the overall solution. Before COVID, and I think that there's a before COVID and after COVID, a BC and a AC. Before COVID, when kids were in school, we had everyone in the same classroom. And a lot of the interventions had to do with helping teachers do a better job teaching and creating learning experiences. And that could be achieved in a number of ways. Digital content, prepackaging the lessons and so on, some mentoring when that was possible, or teacher coaching. In cases where there was connectivity, even teachers from other parts of the country to support the learning. I think that all of that was required to improve the learning experience with the support of technology. So it's been well researched that just deploying technology makes no difference, sometimes even makes a negative difference in the learning. And so it's everything around that makes it work. Now, with students being at home, I think the problem just got bigger because connectivity at home is sometimes even more limited than in schools. The fact that kids are not next to their teachers, and it's harder for them to help with each other. And so the problem has just been amplified. And so I think it's really important now to find ways to support parents to support their kids whenever that's possible. I know that illiteracy, makes that very hard, but just the fact that parents accept that kids can learn at home with asynchronous approaches, find ways for maybe small groups to get together and get some support from the teacher once in a while. It's really critical. I think that we're all learning on how to work on remote learning in environments where the conditions are not ideal. But if things were already not just about the device and technology before, I think they're even less now. They're really about helping the whole community support the learning experience. And I think we're still figuring it out. I think all countries are kind of in the same boat. But one thing is clear, what we had to do before to make projects successful, it hasn't changed. We still continue to have to support the teachers in adopting technology, to support them being effective, and to provide digital content. And whenever possible, use this opportunity to improve the electricity availability and the connectivity availability. And we've seen a great example in Kenya on how a large-scale technology deployment was also a catalyst to electrify the country. And I think it's all about combining these elements to have a bigger impact.
Thank you very much, Federico. And on this topic of combining the elements, we'd like to now move to another piece of the puzzle that as we design, we think about devices, we need to be thinking about what's running on these devices. And we will move to content. Please feel free to reach out to Fred and the World Bank EdTech team. As we said, this is just a preview of a whole set of discussions and an insight into a whole set of discussions that the team is having with task teams across the bank and with clients. Please keep the questions coming in the chat. Thanks so much, Fred, for a taste of the richness of the challenges that we have in front of us related to devices and education. We now like to move to what runs on these devices, digital educational content. I would like to Ariam Mogos or Ariam or Esther, I'm not sure who is speaking first. If you could please share your screen and we will move over to you. Esther is starting. Please introduce yourselves as you speak, Esther and Ariam, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me.
Perfectly clear, Esther and Ariam, perfectly clear.
Oh.
I see Ariam's thumb.
And you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. So my name is Esther Rashisho. I'm from Kenya. I mainly deal in education technology programs. And currently in this particular program, I'm working with Ariam and Ed on developing digital content knowledge pack. So I'll take you through the slides very briefly, and my team who are with me will also assist in answering any questions that would come by. So my apologies, I can't turn on the video. I'm in the bush somewhere and the internet keeps fluctuating. So I believe my team will be able to take over in case of anything. As a start, well, I want to begin from a point that was shared in the chat. At what point do we bring the conversation between devices and content before deployment? And I would begin by saying that it is very important to actually have that discussion long before you even put in the infrastructure, because the devices, the LMS, and all the infrastructure in place will not really yield will not yield much if content is not considered. So we've seen instances where we've had government roll out large-scale education technologies without really considering two main items, and one of which is the teacher's capacity to use these devices and the digital content that is going to be used in them. So this is one area that we think is very important and very critical. Before deploying any infrastructure, that conversation needs to be had. At the same time, the decision makers and ministries and governments, before they can decide to, or they can decide to bring in content, as I've said, once they've had that conversation, there are several other things that they'll need to consider before they do that. One of these is in regard to acquiring content and in the process of teaching and learning, one of which is what digital content is right for your intervention. And this can only happen once you've had that conversation that I've talked about, so that you realize what is our need as a country and what content will we get. And I will address some of this as we move along. What content will we require to get that will address these needs based on the resources that we have? The other thing that we need to consider before bringing in content would be what I just mentioned earlier on, the infrastructure, LMS, devices, and so on, and all that are not will only make sense if we have content that the students interact with. The other consideration that we need to look into is identifying the appropriate use and the several case scenarios that are going to present themselves to us, and what are our goals and objectives, so that when we are making a choice of what content we are going to use, these scenarios are addressed, these objectives are addressed, and these goals are addressed. And this includes areas of geographical dispensation where our learners are. We need to consider that also before we make that decision of what content to get. The other thing is we need to identify problems that need to be addressed or solved, and how digital content might help to address some of these challenges. A good example in Africa, we have an imbalance in terms of the teachers we have versus the learners we have in the schools. It is a good thing to consider whether this digital content that we bring on board is going to help us deliver learning, especially in such areas where we do not have teachers, adequate teachers. In other places, we have pastoralists who keep moving up and down in search of pasture for their animals. And if we are going to consider these kids, digital content could be one of those things that we can consider with the devices that are coming to play that would help address the challenge of the learning continuing even as these pastoralists move from one place to the other. COVID-19 was a very good example that showed learning can actually come to a stop. So we need to consider the kind of good digital content that we can have that will ensure that that learning continues even when issues like COVID happens. Of course, we would also need to consider the cost-benefit analysis as we consider the type of content we are looking for. So most of this information is available in the digital content knowledge pack that will be shared once it's complete. Now, what are these types of content are we looking at? So when you're considering the kind of content you want to deploy, depending on the infrastructure that you have, you could be looking at either the interactive digital content that has all the multimedia facets included in it. In some instances, you look at ebooks, and in these cases, you'll also look at e-textbooks, e-readers, and stuff like that, depending again on what your situation is. We can look at audio-video content. We'd have radio programs and TV programs that are probably more applicable in the condition and situations that we are in. There are several e-workbooks and worksheets that are there. Gamification is also becoming very important recently, where we have content packaged in the form of games, where learners can continue engaging in them as they learn various concepts that are there in the curriculum. We have assessments and tests now going online. We will have a KP that addresses assessments. And also we can look at various things, areas or where content is packaged in multimedia. A good example would be animations that are used and simulations in places, especially where the laboratories are not available. That is a very common common problem that we find in Africa, that schools are there, they've been set up, but there are no resources to set up the labs and all the things that come with the lab. So simulations would be a type of content that you could consider to replace the laboratories or have them as virtual labs. So when you think about content and the type of content you want to bring in, I've mentioned the types that you could think of. There are certain other things that you need. How do you acquire this content? How do you get this content? Now, there are various ways that you can get the content. You can either buy that content, and the content that is out there for pay is normally referred to as commercial content, and this content is available and developed by private sector and other vendors, and it is aligned to the education standards and curriculum, and usually it's available through either the subscription model, or you may pay a license or one-time fee depending on what the agreement with the vendor is. But bottom line is, it is very important for us to understand, even if you want to buy content, do you have the capacity or do your teachers have the capacity to know what is the right content that can be mapped to your curriculum and into the learning environment that you're getting into? So whatever it is that you decide to buy, then you must consider whether it is aligned to your content, to your curriculum and the standards that are set, and that it is going to play in the devices or the infrastructure that you have set in place. The other consideration when you're buying or when you want to acquire content would be some countries may decide to build their own content. And this could be advised by several factors, that you might decide you do not want to buy content because you want content that is really developed for your own situation or your own country, that is so rigid to your curriculum. Therefore, content that is developed elsewhere might not really work well within your situation. So you might decide then to build that content. But as you decide to build the content, then you must have the capacity to build content in your environment. I will handle that, as I mentioned, as we move on in another slide. It will be very important to check if you have existing in-house capacity to be able to build your own content. There are various reasons why people decide to build content vis-a-vis buying content. Another way of acquiring this content would be to adapt content that is already available. And this is mainly the open educational resources. And these are teaching and learning resources, which are available in any medium, either digital or otherwise, and that reside in the public domain. And they can be accessed under an open license that permits no cost for access. You can use them the way you want. You're allowed to do that. You can adapt them to fit within your situation, and it can be distributed based on what license you are using. At that point in time. So there are certain things that you need to consider when you're looking at content, and especially when you're thinking about buying or building content. When you're building content, it is important to think about whether you have the technical capacity to build that content in terms of, do you have in-house instructional designers? Do you have content authors? Do you have subject matter experts? Do you have the multimedia experts? Do you have the systems administrators who will enable you to put together that content so that you can deploy it for the purpose that it is meant to? The other consideration that you could look into when you're deciding to build the content is whether the local market is mature and competitive enough to absorb that content that you're going to build. You'll also need to look at the cost and benefit analysis, whether it makes sense for you to build content vis-a-vis buying. So on the other side, when you're thinking about buying content, do you have the capacity of the teachers, or do your teachers have the capacity to identify, to curate or evaluate that content so that it meets or it fits within the standards and the curriculum in that teaching and learning environment? Are they able to align that content that they want to buy to the curriculum that they are using? The other one that would be important to look into is if the government, if they are the ones who are intending to buy, whether they have that capacity to work with the vendors to ensure that the content is relevant, and whether it can be integrated to all tool sets, or it is effective and it is appropriately cataloged. The other thing that when you're buying content you need to look into is the mechanism to work with the content creators and vendors so that you can guide the content to ensure that it is in most cases aligned to the curriculum and is also to the standards that are already set. Now that is in regards to content where you want to buy it or build it. But as I mentioned earlier on, you can also get content that is open source, that is free. And when you're thinking about this, there are certain things you're looking into. Are you struggling with designing interventions fast to reach content with affordable content? For example, you have all these children all over the place and you may not have enough resources. Considering OERs would be one way to go so that you're able to get as much content as possible to reach as many kids as you possibly can. So OER could be one of the areas that you'd want to look into. It is content that is accessible, easily adaptable to the scenarios that you are into. So if you do not have enough resources, or as a country you've decided that is the way to go, then you would want probably to look into the OERs. They are easily available. You can get them as and when you require, and in most cases easily adaptable to the various curricula that is in existence. And as we look on, we'll see some of the areas or some of the OERs that is available across the world. Some of the case studies of where this has been used, the digital content has been deployed in any of the formats that I've talked about. Peru has done that, and they have curated already existing content, meaning that they are using the open educational resources, although they have also combined in building some of the content which they built because it was not in existence. So they used the personnel that they had through a project that they had to build content in areas that was not available. Therefore, they have tried to ensure that they have content that is free and accessible to their learners, as well as built in areas that they didn't have. Another example would be Kenya. where they, through the digital learning, the digital literacy program, in all the devices that the country, the government was able to supply to all the public schools, they came inbuilt with content. Now for Kenya, they bought content from vendors. So they procured content that went into the devices that the learners got. So that is another example of a country that has used commercial content. So there are various other countries who have used different approaches, and we can look at them as we move along. So what digital content exists?
And Esther, I'll just jump in to let you know you are over time, so we're in the Q&A. We're in the Q&A session now as well. I don't know how many slides you have left, but I wanted you to alert you to that. We have some questions in the chat about exactly this, what kind exists, and what are some practical strategies and lessons from real experience, including Kenya.
Okay, I only have 2 slides, so this one and the next one, which I'll mentioned about, so I will just run through them. So on one side, I have examples of some OERs that are common, for example, OER Commons, and I have attached a link which you can get and probably go run through them. We have African storybooks that has a whole lot of storybooks that are being used in various languages, available in various languages across various countries that can also be used. We have the common one that we know, the Khan Academy. And then the commercial content would have like the World Reader, we have Ubongo, we have quite a number of others that are there. In Africa, those that we know about, we have the World Reader that is very common in Africa. Ubongo is also there in Tanzania. Then we have others who are offering interactive content like Msingi Park, Tech Elimu, Maths Online, and so on and so forth. Just to underscore this, that before you deploy any digital content, it's important it is important to ensure that you have capacity, or your teachers have capacity to curate, to align the content to the set standards and curriculum, because it will not be effective if you have not done that. So I want to leave it at that and probably answer the questions that are there. This slide just talks about some of the practical strategies that we can use before we deploy digital content. So maybe I could leave it at this point, and then we could answer the questions that come. My colleagues will also help me in answering the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Esther. Esther and Ariam both have a wealth of not only theoretical knowledge about this, but very, very practical knowledge about what works and what doesn't in specific contexts and places, especially across East Africa. So we'd be happy to take more questions, including, a basic question I think that people ask is, if we have to choose what type of content, and this may be a good or bad question, what's the most effective content? What's the most impactful content that you've seen used in your experiences? And how did you know?
Ariam, you want to take that?
That's a kind of a tough question. I think the way that we're positioning it in the knowledge pack and more generally is that a mixed model is really important. So I think what we've seen around OER specifically is that OER being sort of aligned to curriculum being adapted and being used at scale is still at a very nascent stage. We have not really seen that across any countries. And so taking sort of an approach where you want to tap in fully to OER really isn't realistic. And at the same time, sort of taking an approach where purchasing content for pay may also not be sustainable, because digital content could be very, very expensive. So I think one thing we've sort of landed on is how to create or build a mixed model where you're tapping into or purchasing digital content for pay, but also supporting more of leaning into open educational resources where it makes sense, and also supporting that ecosystem so that there is a stronger open educational there's a stronger ecosystem around open educational resources where there's more sharing, there's clear alignment to standards, because that just doesn't really exist right now. And so the more practice that happens around that, the more quality resources there's going to be. But there needs to just be more stakeholders actually doing that. Esther, I don't know if there's anything, or Ed, you want to add to that?
I do want to add something to that, if you don't mind. Thank you, Ariam. I do want to suggest that, first of all, the content that's best is going to be the content that you use, whatever that turns out to be. It's going to be highest quality content. I've talked with teachers in developed countries who say they need to show media, they need to show a video or something in class in order to keep the students' attention and explain the concept to them. There are other kinds of content, of course, that are important, such as Ariam suggests, approaching it from a mixed model is probably the best. My thought is just it depends on whether you're going to be using it in an only online environment, or if you're going to be using it in face-to-face in the classroom as well, in which case you have the teacher to interface. The teacher can say, here is an example of a steam engine in this video, and unpack the example in order to make the video more clear. Whereas in a remote and independent learning situation, the same video may just be water over the bridge, if you know what I mean. Thank you, that's all.
So I would say, just to wind up that, is that in addition to what my colleagues have said, content that is aligned to the curriculum and that meets the standard, to me, would be the most appropriate content. Because if you take, and that is why I underscored that you need to have the capacity to know what is the right content, to curate it against the standards and against the curriculum that you have. Otherwise, it will not have any effect. And of course, when you have the standards, they'll tell you if you're going to use maybe multimedia type of interactive type of content with a standard, that the standard will help you know which is the content that has high quality. So we'll need the two things, the standard and the curriculum, to determine the type of content or the quality content that you can have. And the teachers must have that skill, that competency to be able to do that. Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Esther, Ariam, and Ed. And we will hear from Ed again, and Ariam and Esther, I think, as well shortly. We have a number of great questions in the chat. A reminder that this is just a preview of a much larger knowledge pack that addresses all sorts of issues related to digital content, and a preview, if you will, of a much larger training session on this topic that will occur inside the EdTech Policy Academy. We have interesting questions raised in the chat about content for children with special needs, this issue of digital content versus offline or print content, which are better. Marguerite cited an OECD study that said, well, you know, the digital content, people who use that had lower lower impact with them. What's up with that? So these are additional things that we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A as we go forward in the chat now, but we'd like to thank Esther, Ariam for this preview, if you will, of digital educational content. And we'd now like to continue with this theme, thinking about how all this content, where is it? How do you keep it? Where does it reside? Talking about learning management systems, talking about individual pieces of content as part of a larger content system. With that, I'd like to introduce Ed Gable to talk about LMS, or learning management systems.
Yes, thank you, Mike. I'm going to try to figure out how to share this presentation, and make things work the way I want them to. So learning management systems, this presentation has been developed by myself with Esther Gacicio, from whom you just heard, John Moravec, Iñaki Alejandro Sanchez Giarusta, and with comments from the World Bank's EdTech team. The most important thing I think to understand is, can you guys hear me and see me okay? First thing.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the most important thing is to understand what a learning management system is. It's sometimes known as a virtual learning environment, which seems to be a little more focused on education than on training and corporate training. There's a lot of uses of LMSs in corporate situations, for corporate training, in whether it's onboarding of new employees, professional development of existing employees, or outreach to clients. There are many other uses of LMSs for higher education. There are, to be honest, few uses of LMSs to resolve the issues of remote or distance education with in national K-12 school systems. But we will talk a little bit about some possibilities there in a bit. So a digital learning management system is primarily the glue between the device, can be seen as the glue between the devices and the digital content. It provides students a way to access in independent distance education circumstances. It provides students a way to access the content and participate in classes. It provides a way for teachers to manage those classes by first creating sequences of digital content, and secondly, by communicating with students, assessing student knowledge, yes?
Ed, do you have, are you projecting your presentation? If so, we do not see it.
Oh, I am projecting my presentation. I thought you could see it. It says here participants can now see what you are sharing. Hover over the area above to access controls that you stop sharing. I'm going to.
Do you have multiple screens? Are you sharing a different screen?
I might be. Okay, let me see what I can do here. I'm going to stop this presentation and I'm going to move it. Can you see the presentation now?
We cannot know. We still see your smiling face.
Well, I am so sorry about that. At least I'm smiling. So I just I'm kind of stymied. I don't know what to say here. Let me see if I can figure out screen sharing of slightly different. Use slideshow, swap displays. How about now? Can you see it now?
No, we cannot. We're seeing everyone's.
Yeah, I see that.
See if I can grab it for you, Ed, and screen share.
Great.
But just keep going, and in the meantime, I'm going to try to pull it up.
Okay. So the other thing that LMSs do is that they enable ministries of education to aggregate data about student learning. In other words, ministries of education can harvest the data from instantiations of LMSs in schools and use those to base their curriculum and other decisions on those data. So, Mike, all I'm seeing is the slides. If you're seeing me, I don't even know what to say. I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is not a next slide, it's an animation actually, because this question has come up, is Google Classroom an LMS? The answer I think to that is no. What is Google Classroom? It's a free classroom management system widely used in many countries, in mostly OECD countries, I believe, but it's used to communicate with teachers, for teachers to use it to communicate with students. It's used to assign homework, to manage classes via quizzes, delivery of content, and so on and so forth, with the assumption that there is a strong online component that happens outside the classroom. In addition, Google Classroom is not a virtual classroom. Virtual classrooms will provide collectively experienced learning. In other words, they're an online forum or environment where the teacher can conduct basically classroom-like activities. So Google Classroom is a valuable tool and it is free, but it is not a learning management system because it doesn't meet the minimum requirements. It doesn't allow students to access content. It doesn't allow teachers to access content, to sequence content, and it doesn't allow for teachers to engage with students in a virtual environment. It is primarily a supplement to the classroom experience. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. Ariam, are you able to project my slides?
Yeah, I think I just need 1 minute. I'm sorry. I've just pulled it up.
Okay, I am no worries. I am on the slide that starts out ask why. As Bob and Mike have said, we're going to be this question is extraordinarily important. And I think what we find is when we ask what is the problem to be solved, we find that digital learning management systems are primarily valuable in two instances. One is to support distance learning, which it's typically considered to be nationwide learning in K-12 school environments, and that it could include geographically marginalized students. It could include students who are otherwise unable to come to school or to access the resources that are used in school because they have low vision or low audio capacity or so on and so forth. So in other words, via LMSs could be used to increase inclusivity. It could also be used to prepare the school system for the next closure resulting from a pandemic, from a disaster, or from a conflict. In other words, beefing up the school system's capacity to deliver remote distance education. And finally, this enables the adaptation for proximal closure would be the opportunity to reach students or teachers system-wide, providing students with online access to learning throughout the country, or provide teachers with access to training in, say, standards or in the use of content or in the use of digital devices. Finally, the LMS can be used to support in-class learning. Typically what would happen, as I think I mentioned in the content discussion, the teacher may want to run a video 3 or 4 times in a given classroom in order to adumbrate the learning that is being supported by the video. But in terms of the use of learning management systems, sometimes those become the use of flipped classrooms. In other words, students access the content at home, they watch the video, perhaps they do an interactive simulation, they take an assessment, then they come to class and they discuss. So they meet with the teacher who is primarily working as a facilitator to help the students unpack the problems that they have already experienced in relation to the digital content. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is that you all as TTLs need to start preparing your clients to interact with sales reps, engineers, and others, and you need to interact with the MOE personnel. We'll talk about what some of the main questions are in a moment. The most important things to do and to see that are done, I think, are the development of use cases so that you have a bulletproof understanding of who, when, how, and why students and teachers will use a given LMS, how they'll access it, what devices they'll be using. Will it be a full screen device like a laptop? Will it be a smaller screen device like a smartphone? Will it be via connectivity that is subsidized or is it by the government? Will it be zero rated by the telecommunications operator? Those are all questions that need to be answered before you begin development of the LMS. You need to know who, how, what, when, and why, among other things. And you use the use cases to develop a software requirement specification, which helps you prioritize the functions and characteristics of the vendor's platform. If you're developing a new platform, can help you say this this function is present, this function is substandard, this function we don't need so much. And then ultimately, the SRS should be vetted by all stakeholders, and the output of the SRS, the adaptation of the learning management system, should also be vetted by all stakeholders. I'm moving on to the next slide, which suggests what are the key questions for LMS evaluation. The first question is the interface easy to use? One of the findings that we had from the discussion with the Malaysia team, I believe, is that their teachers lack digital skills. And that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to accommodate. You need to provide training to the teachers, first of all, but you need to also make sure that the interface is not engaging the teachers in multiple operations to log in multiple operations to access the content, in multiple operations to sequence the content. Then you want to know, other questions you might want to know are what the factors are that affect the number of concurrent users. What is the anticipated load of users? All students are accessing content at the same time. Is that happening? Are they all doing it after school? Are they all doing it during school? How does that affect the number of concurrent users that are tasking the Ministry of Education servers or the cloud servers of the provider? How is that? Is there a load test that is being conducted to let you know that your system is simplifying or delaying some of the calls to the server so that there's no jam up of too much denial of service, basically? And then the question I think is, to what extent are there schools, teachers, and students who are offline or will be using the tool offline? What kinds of accommodation do you make for those? There are several basically open source LMSs that are available in off-the-grid solutions. One of these is Moodlebox, which has been deployed. I think John, my colleague John, knows more about Moodlebox than I do by far. Moodlebox has been deployed in, I think, 12 countries, and Colibri, which has been deployed in more countries and includes content from the Khan Academy and others. Colibri specializes in just delivery of off-the-grid content that is accessible in schools and to a certain extent by users outside of schools, although they have yet to finalize that development, I believe. So then I think one of the key questions, as Esther pointed out in the content discussion, is how are you going to develop or customize the content that populates this LMS? So one idea is to be sure that some authoring tools are included in LMSs. And I think you want to make sure that there are efficiency hacks, if you will, available in the LMS. These could include tools and templates that enable you to reuse content that you have in development, that enable you to tag content effectively, that enable you to develop content based on prior content. I think you also want to ask, the main question, I think, is to be sure that there are instructional designers involved in both the coordination of the content and in the coordination of the development of the localization of the content and in the development of the content, the design and development of the content itself. So you want to make sure, in terms of coordination, you want to make sure that all parts of the curriculum are being supported that need to be supported. In terms of development, you want to make sure that the content can be developed efficiently, it can be linked to the curriculum, can be found in the learning management systems repository. And then finally, you want to find out you want to make sure that there is support for data and analysis. You want to make sure that you are understanding whether the LMS will be used on site in classrooms or only for remote learning. I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Okay, and Ed, I think Ed, we're about at time here. We want to get into EMIS.
I do. Thank you. I'm going to be almost done here. There are other design factors addressed in the LMS knowledge pack. Some of these we've talked about already. Some of them are addressed extensively, like hosting. We talk a little bit about assessment. We'll talk more about assessment tomorrow. In terms of open source versus commercial, I think that what we see there are several deployments. There's a good mix in the market of open source solutions. Moodle and Canvas are both open source. There's a good mix of LMS commercial and open source providers. There are more instantiations of Moodle in K-12 in terms of national K-12 systems, such as in Mali and in Cabo Verde, as the so as the slide suggests, and there are a number in Africa of, there are I think 3 Moodle customization companies that are required, because I think it's important to note that even with an open source LMS, the cost of customization, the costs are about even. They do that to you. The costs are about even between customization of an open source LMS and procurement of a license for a proprietary LMS. I think you need to determine what your real requirements and needs are. That is the end of it. There is a list of additional, thank you very much. There is a list of additional LMSs at the end of this presentation. And I think that does it for me. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ed, and Ariam and Esther. Sorry to cut you off. I'd like to go. Jaime Saavedra has joined us, and he has a question about digital educational content in general. Jaime, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much for this presentation. Super useful. I have a couple of questions. First, to the on the previous presentation on digital content, the digital content discussion. It was said that teachers have to be prepared to use any digital content that is bought. It has to be aligned to the curriculum. My question is, I mean, in which way do commercially available software in general, right? What would be particular regarding that, things that one can buy? What would be a good example, right, of countries who have been able to deploy at scale, right, digital content that can be bought, and actually that we can say yes, and it was well aligned to the curriculum? Do you have any examples in the global South? I would say that it's not Transvaal, right, and in which there's a good integration of commercially bought software or any type of content with the current curriculum, right? And related to that, for any of our TTLs, right, between OER and commercially available software, what will be the best thing to explore first, right? I mean, in the second case, in the case of commercial content, is always we have to handle the issue of procuring that. So which way would be better to explore first? And my second question is on this issue of the LMS. Again, what would be a good example, right, of recent deployment of a new LMS system that is really able to integrate, allow to manage the system, allow to manage the classroom, and integrate different software solutions? And my worry is that usually when we decide that, okay, so we need a revamp in the system in any country, there's already stuff happening today. There might be an LMS somewhere, there is some digital content, they don't talk to each other, but still you need to build on what exists, right? So what would be a good example in which building on what exists today, where there has been a good deployment of a new LMS system at scale? Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Jaime. I think so. Jaime, and to the team, Jaime raises some first order and fundamental questions about thinking about digital educational content. I recognize that we have JP and Agatha already queued up to go for the EMIS. We could have 1 minute quick response to Jaime now, and we can follow up with more information. A reminder that this is a preview of very large knowledge packs around educational content, and a preview of a much longer, in-depth sessions at the EdTech Policy Academy that will debut later this year. We have just 1 minute quickly to address one key response to Jaime's question, that we'd like to move to JP and Agatha. I'll let Ariam, Esther, or Ed fight as to who wants to respond to Jaime here.
Esther, do you want to give the example of how Kenya's used commercial content? And then maybe we can talk about how OER has been mobilized to fill in some of the gaps.
And we can talk about 1 minute's worth, because we have JP and Agatha.
Really quick.
Okay, I'll just be very quick. Thank you, Ariam. Kenya did, I mentioned it in the chat. I tried to answer it in the chat. The way Kenya is structured, the policies that are there, instructional materials development is a liberal market where other people can develop. And government's role is to check for quality and approve that material. Therefore, in regards to the digital content, especially for the new curriculum that is coming into place, in the digital literacy program, the country actually bought content for all the learners in all the primary schools. The primary schools are about 25,000 schools, and the learners are 1.2. So all the children and the devices were supposed to be one-to-one of this for these kids. So each of these devices came with content, and this content was procured by the government from the vendors or those content creators who have done, and they have continued to do that. They did that for grade 1, they've done for grade 2. Currently now they are procuring content for grade 3 and not grade 4, because they've already done 1, 2, and 3, and next year they'll be doing for grade 5. So as the curriculum develops further, then they acquire they procure content for them in that regard. Previously, they had built content, especially for the high school. They had built content in all the areas. But again, because of that policy and why they built content then is that there were no vendors who were willing to go into digital content. And therefore, government through KCD built content for high schools at that point in time. Now that they have decided to, private companies are now building digital content. Now government cannot build, so they can only buy because of the policy that is there that exists. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And I think we'll have to wrap the session up here. And that what Esther has described the Kenya, where you have adoption and adaptation of OER content, development of content internally, and then increasingly as markets become more mature, being able to go out and buy in market is a typical way that many countries have the typical life cycle of the usage and development and usage of digital educational content. Unfortunately, this is, again, just a preview of a much more in-depth discussion around these topics that will take place, and a much more in-depth knowledge pack on this that is being drafted as well and shared this summer. With that, I'd like to thank the team, Ed, Ariam, and Esther, and I'd like to go to JP and Agatha. Looks like maybe Agatha is first. EMIS 2.0. Again, this is just a real quick set of highlights about a topic that I think all of us in education have, let's be honest, struggled with over time. Over to you, Agatha and JP.
Okay, thanks, Michael. JP, are you on? Do you hear me? Because I don't hear JP.
We hear you, Agatha, and we see your slides.
Right. Okay. So JP, do you hear me? Okay. All right. So I'm not sure where JP is, but we'll get started. He emailed me though a minute or so ago regarding co-presenting. So I'm not sure if something has gone wrong.
He's connected.
Oh, he's connecting. Okay. All right. Maybe just give him a couple of seconds. As he connects, maybe I'll just do the first couple of slides to introduce us to the topic. So the topic is EMIS 2.0, also known as a learning and accountability system architecture. So you'll see through the slides, we will reference this acronym, LASA. And if you keep wondering what it is, this is what it is, Learning and Accountability System Architecture. Next slide. We intend to quickly cover these 8 subtopics. The overall knowledge pack is over 150 pages of detailed toolkits that can be used. So what we have here are about 9 slides where we give a high-level overview of some of the questions that we were trying to address and where you can get a little bit more information. JP, are you here? Do you want to start or should I go ahead? Okay, I don't hear you, but the minute you're here, then let me know and I'll stop speaking. So we created this AMIS 2.0 knowledge pack. And what it is a practical toolkit for ministries of education. And the reason we created it was to help guide ministries of education on how to effectively think about both the design and deployment of systems, technology, and process. The emphasis here is on the design. A couple of slides later, we'll go through what the roadmap should look like for any country that's looking to deploy an EMIS system. A huge emphasis is put on the design. The bulk of the work for this to be successful must be in the design phase. And we provide a lot of toolkits to support countries to do that. The focus of the design is to integrate where countries are today with where they want to be in the future. So, different countries are in different places, and we are able to, communicate to them what the ideal end state is, but also taking into consideration the fact that these countries cannot just jump there within a very short period of time. So the toolkit helps provide them with a roadmap of how to eventually get there. And the whole design is focused on using enterprise architectural principles. So EA principles are global industry standards that, have been used in the IT world for the last 15 years, but have not necessarily been implemented in education settings. And as a result, there have been a lot of challenges faced by schools and ministries as they try and put all these devices, software applications together. So the whole focus of EMIS 2.0 is bringing in enterprise architectural principles to pull in all those different systems. Okay, next slide. JP, are you here? Should I go on? Okay, all right. So what is our motivation? EMIS 2.0, the whole entire knowledge pack has been created to support ministries. Sorry, did you speak?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
great.
JP.
Sorry, I've been listening all along. It's just that I'm having problems with my internet. Sorry.
No problem.
So
Take over the
you can
slide.
carry on. You can carry on. Agatha, I just want to make one brief point on the enterprise architecture and what you've mentioned about not being used in education, and just highlight that it actually social protection and health, these principles are being used. So it's not that the public sector are not familiar with those, but in some sectors, this is a language that is becoming more natural. Social protection. And in health to some extent as well, and even among our colleagues in the bank, several of our social protection operations today are actually using these principles when they are designing systems with governments. So please, Agatha, carry on.
Okay, all right. So how can EMIS 2.0 support ministries? So, there's many different ways that this knowledge pack is able to effectively support ministries, but we focus here on 4 of them. The first one is helping support data-driven decision-making. So an EMIS system that's designed using EMIS 2.0 principles can provide the right kind of data that can guide leaders on how to manage learning loss, gauge dropout risk, and encourage re-enrollment, specifically now as we come out of the pandemic and learning moves from home learning to face-to-face learning. Secondly, an effectively deployed EMIS system can help correct some of the flaws with the existing data systems that some of the ministries already have in place. So majority of the countries are already collecting lots of different data, but this data, because of lack of data governance, which we found as a recurring issue in many countries, the data cannot really be used by the ministries to actually drive decisions. So an effectively deployed EMIS 2.0 system can help correct some of these issues. What we've seen is that within the last few years, a lot of ministries of education are producing a lot of data. So the capacity to produce the data far outstrips their ability to then read, use, analyze this data and use it to actually drive decisions. An effectively deployed EMIS 2.0 system can be integrated with analytics and dashboards to help support this kind of data usage for decision making. And the last piece is driving consistency of data across all the different departments that are producing data within the education agency. So an effectively designed EMIS will ensure that there's the right data governance and interoperability between all these different systems. So the policies are in place, ensuring that stipulate how data will be stored, used, managed, and accessed. Okay, I will move to the next slide. So, we're talking about EMIS 2.0, and we've all heard about EMIS before. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of what traditional EMIS is and what EMIS 2.0 should look like. So traditional EMIS, which we refer to as EMIS 1.0, look like the diagram we have here at the bottom, right? So these systems and processes will focus on essentially having periodic one-way transfer of data of student information from the schools to the central government. So typically we would have schools collect this data on paper and pencil, and then when those forms were all gathered, they would go into a central office and they would be keyed into an EMIS system. The data collected would essentially be demographic data. So age, gender, enrollment, dropout rates, and some level of assessment data. What we had there was a one-way transfer of data, right? So there was no feedback back to the schools who were actually responsible for gathering and collecting this data. So the data was essentially collected for reporting purposes, so the ministry wants to understand how many pupils there are so that they can understand how to correctly allocate their resources. In majority of cases, there were no analytics or early warning systems that were incorporated into these systems to actually guide decision-making and improve student outcomes. The end result from a lot of studies has been that this sort of setup typically results in below average results for the Ministry of Education investment. So they invest in this EMIS expecting that it will drive results, but because it's not set up to do that, there's no results other than the inputs that were provided on paper from the schools. So that's traditional EMIS system. JP, do you want to jump in for this slide? You mute.
Sorry, guys. The computer is just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so you want me to go ahead? Okay, all right. So now this is the definition of what EMIS 2.0. So we've gone over what the initial traditional EMIS looked like. So EMIS 2.0 learning and accountability system architecture is essentially an end-to-end architectural design of a comprehensive education data system. So it's not just the EMIS component, but it includes any other component within the education system that either produces or consumes or modifies data. EMIS 2.0, the knowledge pack that we've created, provides countries with the checklists and workflow toolkits between these systems that we've described to support the implementation of a really robust education data system, which meets high independence standards. And what we mean by that is that it meets EA architectural principles and is designed with the goal of providing the catalyst for positive change in the education sector. So quickly to the next slide, just a quick overview of differentiating the two systems. So we've talked about what EMIS 1.0 is and what EMIS 2.0 is. These 5 main areas are what differentiate the two, right? So the first one is data governance. With the EMIS 2.0, there's very clear data policies and checklists put into place to support the Ministry of Education so that there's an assurance of data integrity across all the different education departments that are creating or producing data or consuming that data. There's an interoperability of systems across the education agency. So whether it's an LMS or whatever systems that the ministry has put into place, we define, again, a global international standard of interoperability so that there is no vendor lock-in because one vendor brings in one system that does not interoperate with any other system. Data architecture across all these systems is also designed and mandated, and ministries of education will be provided with the toolkits to be able to do that. Identity management is strongly recommended because having that in place then supports being able to track the students, right from kindergarten up until higher education. There's a focus on microservices instead of monolithic systems that do very many things. And the last piece is a focus on the effectiveness in the analysis and dissemination of findings. So we saw in the previous diagram that with EMIS 1.0, the focus is on collection of the data, but there was very little emphasis on, let's analyze what the data is saying to us and let's disseminate these findings in order to drive continuous school improvement. Let's use this data for decision making. That was not part of the mandate with traditional EMIS systems, but is mandated in EMIS 2.0. So very quick overview of what a system like this can look like. So this is just a very high level picture. So number one here, we have microservice architecture. So systems are built to share data, but they handle a single functionality. So we have the student information system, collaboration tools, LMS, all of these, but they are all singular systems and they are joined here, but they're interconnected where there's access to a central data lake or data warehouse, which centrally manages this shared data. MOE leaders, principals, teachers, parents have access to this data through pre-built dashboards where they're able to then pull out specific reports to be able to review specific performance. And these reports help inform instruction and reallocation of resources effectively. And they drive the programs that are then created for continuous school improvement. And this forms the feedback loop back to the schools. So this is a really high level picture of what an EMIS 2.0 system should look like.
Okay. Agatha, if I may, and JP jump in, we are at the 12.5-minute mark for the 10-minute presentation. And I know we want to get to some questions as well. And then Jaime will need to wrap it up and he needs to go as well. And we apologize to everyone that we are treating all these very complicated topics so quickly. But again, this is meant to be a high-level overview of some key messages from a much larger set of work that is ongoing.
So maybe let me come in here, Agatha, just to wrap it up on the EMIS and kind of focus on this slide and maybe our last slide in terms of how we've been working with teams so colleagues can understand. So if you go back to the roadmap, I think that's an important element. I think the diagram that Agatha showed is the end state of a vision of what an EMIS 2.0 can be. Of course, for us, a critical part of this is the technology maturity of each one of our clients, and we understand that not all of them are exactly at the same place. So we want to meet them where they are, and for that, the way we've envisioning, and this is part of the knowledge pack, is this architecture roadmap, in which in the first year of the engagement, there's this several products or tools in which we want to use with our clients to precisely identify where they are and where they want to get and what are the business needs, right, that they have. And those are the critical elements for the design and to inform the RFP or the contract that the procurement process, right, for vendors that can serve this particular product. Because we are using this architectural approach, right, the idea is that the RFP becomes a lot easier to be done and a lot more concrete for vendors to apply to. And we are using very much kind of industry standards, which again helps future-proof the investment, right, and make sure that whatever is being purchased that doesn't necessarily create a vendor lock-in. Year two is when basically the development of the procurement starts, and of course with piloting and testing of the system and creation of training material on how to use the system. And by year three, we would envision a full-scale rollout, and of course this would be a continuous process, right, in which the system would be improved as we go. But I think one critical element is to assess the technology maturity of the client, identify where they are very concretely, and what would it take for them to be in year 2, 3, 4, right? And this is thinking very much of the life cycle of our projects and our dialogue. And if you go to the last slide, Agatha, please. We have already engaged with a few teams in Guyana, Edo State in Nigeria, Morocco, Niger, Vietnam. And I think the approach has always been to first start with a conversation with TTLs to explain the vision and the problems that we're trying to solve with this particular approach. In most cases, this actually led very quickly to a conversation with the client in order to explain the same principles to the client. And most clients, actually, all clients that we've engaged, have found that this would really resonate with them. Edo State, Morocco, or two, in which we are now in active dialogue with the client, and really moving from a sensitization to an engagement, right, with the TTLs, with the teams, in which we're basically bringing in these principles and help shape the program around these elements. So I'll stop here for questions and next steps.
Thanks so much, JP and Agatha. Noting that we're almost out of time, there are lots of questions that have come in, and if we're not able to get to them all today, these are things we'll follow up with people offline and that we'll be exploring in greater depth at the Policy Academy. I note that Ruth asked a very specific and pertinent question related to links between the dashboard work, dashboards and EMIS, what they might be. Ekwa asked a question I think that many people have about, should you have a national level EMIS, an institution level EMIS? Is it different if you're talking about K-12 versus higher ed? And Huma just talked about, the struggles of in Rwanda, and these are repeated elsewhere, of, how can ministries be incentivized to update and improve their EMIS systems? Once they're actually in place and the money's been spent, oftentimes they've said that's been solved. And those are three quick questions. If you have, JP, Agatha, very quick responses to those, and then we'll go to Halil and Jaime to conclude us for the day.
Absolutely. So on the relation between this vision and the dashboard, right? I think it's there are certain elements which are definitely aligned, right? But there are some critical differences as well, in the sense that the dashboard is a survey, right? So it's a sample-based survey. Here we're talking about the administrative system of the Ministry of Education, in which in general, most school census, most of these records are actually census based, right? So there is a difference of the scale. There's also a difference of the frequency, right? Because if the vision of an MS 2.0 is that if it rolled out, or when rolled out, data will come as part of the regular business transactions of the ministry. So the frequency of data, the quantity of data also changes. Now, there are certain elements of this which you could think of natural links between the dashboard work and this. I mean, the dashboard work, it can be seen very much as an R&D element in order to identify types of visualizations, types of questions that maybe the ministry might want to actually roll out at scale in a administrative based system, such as what the MS 2.0 can provide. The dashboard can also work as a quality control of the admin data. So basically, you can use the data that comes from the dashboard to triangulate with what you're getting out of the admin records. Of course, not for all variables, because the dashboard certainly would include more variables than most admin systems. But for certain critical variables, you could use the data from the dashboard to triangulate with the data from an MS system, and this vision of an MS 2.0, of an integrated data system. But the critical difference is how the data is collected, right? In the dashboard, it's a survey. In this one, we're really thinking of transactional data that is generated through the regular processes of the ministry, which most of our ministries, most of our clients are generating data as part of their processes, right? Payment data, the transfer of resources to schools, so on and so forth. I think, touching very quickly on the other question of an MS system, I think that it probably makes sense to think of this by at least between K-12 and higher education as two separate systems, given that the needs can be quite different. I think having a student ID that allows the linking and the tracking and tracing of students throughout their educational life, it's something that is more and more feasible. And that should be, I think, an aspiration for most of the systems, but they don't need to be there's no need to have a single system. I think that part of the value of this architectural approach and the microservices is that there are going to be certain functions which can be repurposed through all grades and all segments of the educational systems, and others are going to be very specific to particular segments. So I think, and that is the value of the microservices, is that you can modularize your functions and fit and use them as needed throughout, and combine them as needed as well. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, JP. Thanks, Agatha. And thanks to all of our presenters today, and the EdTech team and Geek, and Alex for orchestrating this, all, and Lorelei as well. Thanks also to the folks who have participated in the chat, not only with questions, but with solutions. Back and forth. Thanks, Ruth, just one of many, showing that we are resources for each other here on these topics as with others. Tomorrow we will have an additional 4 topics that we'll address very quickly on digital assessment, on technology and literacy, on teacher skills, for remote learning, and for tutoring and remedial learning. So we'll have another quick fire session on 4 very broad topics as well, that will preview the knowledge packs and the Learning Academy. Now I'd like to turn to, I don't know if Halil or Jaime, which will go first or last. Halil, did you want to go before Jaime, or should?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks so much. Today, it's excellent presentations. As mentioned, this pack agenda, we have a lot to cover in a short period of time. In fact, I will discuss with the team to have a comeback again on a maybe separate topics. Just I think today's discussion on EMIS by itself will take half day, maybe more time to discuss, to operationalize, and also the content depends on the country we work. Edo was given an example, but we cannot implement this in every single country. This needs to come from also the client. So I would like to give the context actually. So each topic will take time. I think this is today just to start discussion. This is an important agenda. We are very happy to have Jaime to conclude actually. This is part of our discussion at the global level, but also in the Africa region. I would like to the team also start to think about also the use of technology. I think the first part was quite interesting for me also, the selection of devices, selection of the content. There are different, obviously, the content we can use. So each topic really, it's specialized, we think. We think we know also, but when you get into detail in terms of the operationalization of each topic, really takes time. So I'm very happy to have the team today. On MSA, JP and the team, and on each topic actually today we were able to cover. So we will continue to discuss tomorrow 1.5 hours. The question I will really ask the RTTS also, how to operationalize, how to reach out to information, because it's really technical. If we don't know how to ask the right question, we don't need to know everything. I mean, I'm not an MS specialist, but I should know enough to ask the right question as the TTL to advise the government. The same thing for the selection of the devices. We don't need to know how the tablet is organized. I have 2 tablets here in front of me. I don't know details, but I should be able to discuss really which device would be good if the Ministry of Education, country X, they ask, or we would like to provide tablets every single student. That is the technical question we should be able to ask, but we should be able to bring the technical support. I mean, we have a great team here, but also we can reach out to other outside the bank to bring the expertise to advise our client countries, because that's at the end what we try to provide support our client. Jaime, would you like to conclude, please, for today? Thanks so much, Ethan.
Thank you very much, Halil, and thanks to the presenters, to Ed, Agatha, Esther, Federico, JP. I've learned a lot, and I just want to say 2 quick things. One is piggybacking on what you just mentioned, Halil. Yes, we need to make sure that all our TTLs have the capacity. I mean, not everyone has to be an expert on all these issues, but we need to know enough in order to be able to engage with our client countries. My the challenge that I see is that we need to do two things: to continue increasing the capacity of our teams, but also to increase the capacity of our government counterparts. Right? We need both things to happen at the same time. So what I want to ask the 55 people that are still connected here is to give us ideas what else that it would be needed to do that better, right? So we're having this type of engagements. We're having a learning academy that we're pushing to deploy it as fast as possible. We have the knowledge packs. Oh, that's great, right? What else is needed in order to increase our and our country counterparts capacity? And just to close, I mean, I think it is really critical that we move faster in that frontier on technology, because I mean, nobody here has to be convinced about the magnitude of the challenge that we face in everywhere. I would say everywhere in the planet, even more so in Africa. So my sense is that technology, with all the caveats and all the challenges, and still knowing that we need to work a lot on the human factor of teachers, technology is what will allow us to make to move forward much faster. So technology is the difference between being 2021 and having this same problem 30 years ago, right? So now we have tools that we didn't have 30 years ago. So then we don't need to wait for another 10 years to see a change at the country level. That can happen in a few years. The technology exists, but the deployment and the design and the adaptation of that technology, that's the challenge that we have today. But to work on that, we really need to increase capacity both in the bank and in our counterparts. So any ideas that you guys have in terms of what else should be done or we can do, please let your manager or myself directly shoot me an email and let me know what else we can do. So thank you very much to everyone for the team to organize that. This is great, and let's keep on going. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Jaime. Thanks, Halil. Thanks to the 54 people who are still with us. Apologies for going a little bit over today. Even though we've been working remotely for over a year now, we still have technical challenges, but we all work through them together. We look forward to tomorrow sharing and talking with you about digital assessment, about literacy and technology, about teacher skills for remote learning, tutoring and remedial learning. With that, we'll end today's session. Thanks so much. We'll be following up with some of you directly in response to questions we did not get to. Feel free to reach out to all of us, and have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.